Up next, it's that time in the program to turn our attention over to the markets. A lot of movement happening earlier this week globally as the markets opened on Monday. We sat down with Heartland Farm Partners President Jeff Peterson earlier this week to see how things are shaping out in the grain markets. Well, Jeff, thanks for joining us as we sit here on Wednesday. I think it's fair that we need to start back on Sunday night into Monday where we saw stock markets absolutely plummeting. How did that impact corn and soybeans as we sit here and talk on Wednesday?
Sure, there's a few things that happen. Anytime you have that pressure coming out of the stock market, it naturally causes everybody to get a little nervous, and normally you have a little bit of selling off in the market. First places we look is what happens to energy, and we did see a little bit of weakness happen over in the crude oil market. But surprisingly, Alex, that actually the markets held up pretty well, especially corn, considering what we had for outside pressure. So it puts a little wet blanket, and now the market starts looking ahead again.
Yeah, it's looking ahead to August 12th, which is the next release of the WASDE report. As we sit here, do you think there will be any changes in corn and soybean acres and the numbers in this report?
Yeah, I think it sure sets itself up for that. So a few things we want to kind of dig into. So if we think about it, when we see that basically the May numbers put together, that's all based off of survey data out of NASS, and that would be what the prospective planting report is. And then we get to the end of June and we see the planted acreage reports. Now, what was interesting this year is that there was some slow planting that was going on, and there was acres that was a little bit above normal that still had to be planted on corn and soybeans, mainly across South Dakota, Minnesota, and a few parts of Iowa. And what we didn't see them do is a special survey. So as we get to this year, everybody's really looking at those acres numbers saying, okay, could there be some changes? Now, what we also saw come out of NASS is NASS said they're going to do something a little bit different this year. They're going to feel like they're going to incorporate the FSA data and the RMA data a little bit more so than they would have in the past, because they believe that they've got more data available this year than they would have had in the past. Not sure why that is, but that's where they're announcing. So as a result, when that information gets brought into the WASDE report, we think it'll have two impacts. We think it'll have an impact on the planted acreage. We also think it'll have an impact on the harvested acres. On corn, for instance, together, we think that could bring down the harvested acreage number about 1 to 1.5 million acres. And over on the soybean side, we think that could make about a 500,000 acre difference.
So here in Market Journal, we've seen some producers who have experienced some severe hail damage. Really across the state of Nebraska saw a lot of this. Does that impact the numbers here in the WASDE, or is that too small of a scale to really make an impact?
You know, here's how I always look at that is my heart goes out to those individuals that had that damage. And if it happened on your farm, it's very serious and it's very real. The challenging part we have is that usually every year somewhere across the Corn Belt, whether it's an eastern Corn Belt or the western Corn Belt, we've got that type of damage. So unfortunately, it probably wasn't a big enough scale, even though there's some reports it could have been 450 or 500,000 acres, probably won't necessarily be a big enough impact to impact overall big picture of the WASDE, but what I can guarantee it will impact the local basis in those areas as we get closer to harvest and see how those crops turn out.
Okay, so potentially acres could be down, but what about yield, and will that eventually just even off on those charts?
Well, I tell you what, that's the million-dollar question. So what's always interesting when we get to August, for one, it's a great time of the year. We know we've got through really pollination really good conditions. We've got a few areas that could have had a few problems, but the big difference is in the methodology. So let's talk about that. So when we have the May, June, and July reports that come out, those are all put together by the World Ag Outlook Board. You know, as part of the WASDE group that puts together those numbers. They're working off of modeling on what they think the yields are going to be. However, when we get to August, there's a change, and that change is that they hand that off to NASS, the National Ag Statistics Service, at both the national level and the state level. State level gets involved in implementing the surveys. So what that looks like then is they'll survey about 15,000 farmers, and they'll ask them how do they think their yields look. So they take that data. In addition, what they'll do is that they'll then look at satellite data and say, okay, how does the plant health compare to past years? And they'll bring that together and they'll come up with a yield. So a few things to kind of think about. Last year in the August report, the yield came in at 175.1. The yield ended up at 177.3. But so as a result, the yield came up as we went, but what we're really comparing back to is a 175.1. Now this year, okay, the yield we're starting off with is a 181. So the big question on everybody's mind is that, well, how does this really compare to last year? What we go back and look at, we look back and say, well, how does the crop condition data look? Well, you've got a 67% good to excellent rating on corn versus a 57% last year. And then over on the bean side, you've got a 58%. and that's comparing back to, it's a better number than what we'd have physically had last year. So overall, those conditions look good. Now, when we dig a little bit deeper, we say, well, can we get some insights into how the plant health looks? So when we look at that NDVI data, that plant health data, what it shows is that it is slightly better than it is last year. So it does look like we're going to have, some bigger yields coming in this next WASDE report.
Jeff, a wealth of information. All of this eventually comes down to grain marketing plans for our producers. What is important for them to keep in mind right now?
Yeah, a couple things I think. So here's what we have to dig into. So one, we have to go back and look at this old crop, right? So on the old crop side, they have to decide what they're going to do with it. We've got some really good basis levels out there. And I think, there's still bushels in the bins. And then some of the past years we've had in Nebraska, maybe the yields have been off in areas, so they've been able to hold some of those bushels. But this year, they're probably going to need to get those moves. So I'd really encourage them on the old crop to get the bushels moved, at least on basis contracts. The big challenge really comes into the new crop. And what we really find on the new crop, we know for most everybody that they're below cost of production here. I would say for those bushels that have to move at harvest, really start doing your numbers, figuring out where your break evens are, figure out how much you're going to have to physically move at harvest time. And then think about, as we come into harvest here, if we get a little bounce in the market, then I'd say we need to go ahead and make some sales for the stuff that has to go in at harvest time. For anything that's post-harvest, I still think there's enough world problems out there that we'll get some better opportunities post-harvest to sell those bushels that you have in the bin.